On one afternoon in August, the power died for 50 million people across the northeast of a continent in minutes, while the operators could only watch. On an afternoon the following spring, $1 trillion evaporated from the American stock market in about half an hour and then came flooding back, and no human being had chosen any of it. On one morning in summer, 8.5 million computers running the world's hospitals and banks and airlines went dark at nearly the same second, killed by the software installed to keep them safe. 3 decades, 3 technologies, and not one of them had a villain you could blame. Everyone who studied these disasters closely kept backing into the same conclusion, then going quiet about what it meant. Because all of it, the blackout, the vanished trillion, the dead machines, traces to a single argument a sociologist published in 1984. He proves that in certain systems, catastrophe is not a risk you can shrink with more care or more money. It is a property of the design, sitting in the wiring, guaranteed to surface eventually. He named the systems that were fatal and the direction not to build them in. But we spent the next 40 years building almost everything you depend on in exactly that direction, faster every year, and calling it progress. Tonight we go back to the control room where he first saw it, 4 in the morning, 1979. We passed through a reactor torn apart during a test of its own safety system, a night the world nearly ended over a broken chip worth 46 cents, and a passenger jet whose software fought its pilot for the controls and won. By the end you will understand why the operator was never the one to blame, why every safety feature we add makes it worse, and why the room where these accidents happen may soon have no one left in it. Settle in and stay to the end, because this trail runs from a reactor in 1979 to the room you are sitting in right now. If you want more like this, it lives on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, the membership behind this channel, Prior Signal, and a few others like it. Members get every episode ad-free across all of them, plus early access before anything reaches YouTube. Subscribe or join if you have not. Let's go back to where this began. At 4 in the morning on the 28th of March, 1979, a man in a control room in Pennsylvania did everything right. He followed every procedure he had been trained on. He trusted every instrument in front of him. And in doing so, he came within about 30 minutes of causing the worst civilian nuclear disaster in the history of the United States. That is not the disturbing part. The disturbing part is that afterward, when the smartest people in the country were assembled to find out who had failed, they could not find him. They looked for months. They interviewed everyone who had been in that building. They reconstructed the accident second by second, valve by valve, alarm by alarm. And the conclusion they kept backing into, the one that almost nobody wanted to write down in plain language, was that nobody in that room had actually made a mistake. Every decision those operators made was reasonable given what they could see. The machine had done exactly what it was built to do. And what it was built to do, it turned out, under a very specific and entirely predictable set of conditions, was destroy itself. I want to tell you how that happened in detail, because the details are the whole story. And then I want to tell you about the man who looked at this accident and 100 others like it and concluded something that should genuinely bother you. Not a nuclear engineer, a sociologist, a man who studied how organizations behave, who had spent his whole career thinking about power and bureaucracy and why large human systems do the things they do. He looked at the wreckage of the nuclear age and he wrote down a sentence that most of the people running our world have still not absorbed. He said that in certain kinds of systems, catastrophe is not a risk. It is a property. It is not a thing that might happen if you are unlucky or careless. It is a thing the system is guaranteed to produce eventually, by virtue of how it is wired, no matter how careful you are, no matter how much you spend, no matter how many safety features you bolt on. He gave these disasters a name that still sounds like a contradiction. He called them normal accidents. And the reason you have probably never heard that phrase, even though it describes the world you are living in right now, is a story in itself. Let me take you back into that control room first. The plant was called 3 Mile Island, on an island in the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg. There were 2 reactors. The one that failed, Unit 2, was running at about 97% of full power that night, which is to say it was doing its job perfectly. Somewhere in the plumbing that has nothing to do with the nuclear reaction itself, in the ordinary machinery that moves water around, a small amount of moisture got somewhere it should not have been. Maybe a cupful. It interfered with the air pressure that ran some of the pumps. And that cupful of water, in a plant designed to contain the most concentrated energy source human beings have ever harnessed, was enough to start the fall. The main pumps that fed water into the system stopped. That is not supposed to be a catastrophe. The plant is built for exactly this. When those pumps stop, the turbine trips. And when the turbine trips, the reactor automatically shuts itself down, which it did in seconds, exactly as designed. Control rods dropped into the core, and the chain reaction stopped. If the story ended there, you would never have heard the name 3 Mile Island. But a nuclear core that has just shut down is not cold. It is still ferociously hot from what is called decay heat, the residual radioactivity cooking away. And it needs water moving over it, or it will destroy itself from the inside. As the reactor shut down, pressure inside the system spiked, which is normal, and a relief valve at the top of the pressurizer opened to let off steam and bring the pressure back down. That is normal too. Everything so far is the system working. Here is where a machine that was working became a machine that was lying. The relief valve was supposed to open, vent the pressure, and then close again about 13 seconds later once the pressure dropped. The signal to close was sent, but the valve did not close. It stuck open. And now, through a valve that everyone believed was shut, the water that was keeping the core alive began pouring out of the reactor and down into a drain tank on the floor below. This exact valve had a history. On this model of reactor, it had failed roughly 11 times before at other plants. The company knew. And almost the same sequence, a stuck-open relief valve draining a reactor, had happened at another plant called Davis-Besse only about 18 months earlier. At Davis-Besse, the operators figured it out in around 20 minutes, and nothing terrible happened, partly because that reactor had been running at low power. Nobody made sure that the lesson from Davis-Besse reached the men who would need it at 3 Mile Island. That warning existed, it simply never arrived. But the stuck valve, on its own, was survivable. The operators had instruments, they had training. All they had to do was understand what was happening. And this is the moment the accident stops being a mechanical failure and becomes something stranger, something that no amount of better engineering was ever going to fix. There was a light on the control panel for that valve. The operators looked at it, and the light told them the valve was closed. They believed it, because why would you not believe your own instruments? But the light was not wired to the valve. The light was wired to the signal that told the valve to close. It reported that the command had been sent. It did not, could not, report whether the valve had actually obeyed. The command went out, the light went dark, and to every trained human being in that room, a dark light meant a closed valve. It was the truth as far as the instrument was capable of telling the truth. It was also completely wrong. The valve was open, the core was draining, and the one indicator that should have screamed at them was quietly, confidently telling them that everything was fine. Think about what that does to a person trying to solve a problem in real time. Every subsequent piece of information they received, they now had to fit around a false certainty. They had been handed a lie by a machine they had no reason to distrust, and then asked to reason their way out of a disaster while holding that lie as a fixed point. And it got worse, because there was another instrument feeding them the wrong story. They could not directly see how much water was in the reactor core. Nuclear plants of that era did not give operators a direct reading of the coolant level over the core itself. What they had was the water level in the pressurizer, a separate tank, and they used that as a proxy. Normally it is a decent proxy. But that night, because coolant was draining out of the stuck valve in an unusual way, the pressurizer level read high. It read high while the actual core was becoming uncovered. To the operators, a high pressurizer level meant there was plenty of water in the system. It meant, if anything, they had too much water. The instruments were telling them the exact opposite of the truth, and they were telling it confidently. And they were telling it in the language the operators had been trained for years to trust. And so, the operators did the thing their training told them to do when there is too much water in the system. The emergency cooling had kicked in automatically, flooding high-pressure water into the reactor, which was the one thing keeping the core covered, and the operators, reading a pressurizer that said the system was nearly full, throttled it back. They reduced the emergency cooling. To avoid a condition called going solid, which their procedures warned them against, they turned down the flow of the water that was, at that exact moment, all that stood between them and a meltdown. They were not being careless. They were being obedient to a set of readings that had been corrupted by the interaction of two independent failures nobody had told them to expect. A stuck valve they could not see, and a proxy gauge lying about the level. Each one alone would have been an incident. Together, feeding into each other, they built a picture of reality inside those men's heads that was perfectly coherent and perfectly false. And they acted on it, correctly, and made everything worse. There was even a third failure hiding in the room. Emergency backup pumps had started automatically, exactly as designed. But they were pumping against valves that had been closed for maintenance and left closed. 2 indicator lights would have shown this. One of them was hidden behind a yellow paper maintenance tag hanging from a switch above it. A tag. A piece of paper on a clipboard hook, covering the one light that might have shortened the disaster. It took the operators about 8 minutes to find it. The relief valve stayed open for roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes. In that time, about 32,000 gallons of coolant, something like a third of the water in the primary system, escaped the reactor. The core became uncovered. The fuel began to melt. Later, a bubble of hydrogen gas formed inside the containment, produced by the overheated fuel reacting with water. And about a day and a half into the accident, that hydrogen ignited in a burn that pushed the containment building to roughly half of the pressure it was built to withstand. Half, the margin between the accident you have heard of and the catastrophe you have not, was, at one point that day, a single factor of 2. Now here is the question that matters, and it is the question this entire story turns on. When it was over, when the reactor was stabilized, and the fuel had cooled and the investigators moved in, what exactly had gone wrong? Who do you blame? The President of the United States assembled a commission. They had access to everything, and they went looking, the way human beings always go looking after a disaster, for the failure, the bad component, the negligent operator, the missing rule. They wanted a name. They wanted the thing you could point to and fix, so that everyone could sleep again knowing it would not happen twice. They spent enormous effort trying to determine who had left those backup valves closed after maintenance. They never definitively found out, and more importantly, even if they had found the person, it would not have explained the accident, because the closed valves were only one of at least 4 independent problems, and the disaster came not from any one of them, but from the way they combined. The stuck valve, the lying light, the misleading gauge, the blocked backup, none of them on its own would have taken down that reactor. It was the interaction. It was the way each failure changed the meaning of the others, so that a trained crew reading their instruments correctly arrived at a conclusion that killed the core. You cannot inspect for that. You cannot write a procedure for that, because the procedure would have to anticipate the specific combination, and the whole point is that nobody anticipated it. You cannot train an operator to distrust an instrument that has never lied before, on this one night, in this one way, for reasons that only became visible after the fuel had already melted. And that is the thing the Commission kept circling and could not quite say. There was no villain. There was no single broken part waiting to be replaced. The accident was not in any component. The accident was in the relationships between the components. It was in the wiring. And a wiring diagram cannot be fired, cannot be retrained, cannot be sent to prison. It just sits there in every plant of that design, waiting for the specific combination to come up again. This is the point where a sociologist walked into the story, and what he was about to say would take the comfortable idea of the accident, the idea that disasters are caused by someone screwing up, and he was going to prove, with a rigour nobody in engineering had brought to the question, that for a certain class of machine that idea is a fantasy we tell ourselves so we can keep building the machines. Because if the accident is in the wiring, and the wiring is the price of the thing the machine does, then the accident is not a bug. It is the design. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it in anything. The man who saw it was named Charles Perrow. Everyone called him Chick. He was born in Tacoma, Washington, in 1925, and if you had met him, you would not have picked him out as the person who would write the most unsettling book about technology of the late 20th century. He was not a physicist. He was not an engineer. He had never designed a reactor, or a cockpit, or a chemical plant in his life. He fought in the Second World War in the mountain troops, the ski soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division, then drifted through an experimental arts and ideas college in North Carolina before landing at Berkeley, where he took a doctorate in sociology in 1960. His subject for his entire career was organizations, how large groups of human beings arrange themselves to get things done, and what that arrangement does to them, and who ends up with the power. That background is not a footnote. It is the reason he could see what the engineers could not. The engineers were inside the problem. They thought about accidents the way you think about a broken part, because their whole training was about parts and how to make better ones. Perrow thought about accidents the way you think about a bureaucracy, as a pattern of relationships that has a life of its own, independent of the people inside it. And when he was handed the wreckage of 3 Mile Island, that difference in vision was everything, because he was handed it. In the summer of 1979, in the months right after the accident, Perrow was pulled in to do an organisational analysis of what had happened. He was not a member of the President's Commission itself, and I want to be careful about that because it gets exaggerated in the retellings. He was a sociologist brought in to look at the human and organisational side of the disaster, to make sense of it in the terms his discipline understood. And what he found, when he went looking for a theory that would explain what he was seeing, was that there was no theory. Not in engineering, not in his own field, nowhere. The people who built these systems had no coherent account of why they failed the way they failed. They had statistics. They had probabilities of individual component failures. What they did not have was any framework for the thing that had actually destroyed Unit 2, which was the interaction of failures that were never supposed to meet. And so he built one. And over the next several years he expanded it far beyond nuclear power, into chemical plants and aircraft and ships and dams and mines and space missions and the early warning systems that stood between the world and nuclear war. And in 1984 he published it as a book called Normal Accidents: Living with High-Risk Technologies. It is one of the most cited works in the entire field of organisational sociology, and its central argument is a machine for destroying your peace of mind, because once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere, and you cannot make it go away by hoping. The argument rests on 2 ideas. Just 2, and the reason the book is dangerous is that the 2 ideas are simple enough to hold in your head at once, and true enough that you will start applying them to your own life within about a day. The first idea is what Perrow called interactive complexity. Some systems are what he called linear. That does not mean simple. A car assembly line is not simple, but it is linear in the sense that the parts interact in expected, visible, familiar ways, in sequence, the way you would draw them on a flowchart. This step feeds the next step, feeds the next step. When something goes wrong in a linear system, you can usually see it, trace it, and understand it, because the interaction that failed was one you already knew about. It was on the diagram. A complex system, in Perrow's specific sense, is one where parts can interact in ways that are not on the diagram, where a component that has nothing to do with another component in the normal flow of things can suddenly affect it through a path nobody planned that is invisible until it happens and incomprehensible for some crucial stretch of time after it happens. A cup of water in the wrong place interfering with the air system that runs a pump. A light wired to a signal instead of to the valve it appears to describe. A gauge that is a reliable proxy right up until the one situation where it inverts. These are complex interactions. They are the hidden connections between things that were supposed to be separate. And you cannot design them all out, because the whole reason the system is complex is that it is doing something complicated in a small, tightly packed space, and in that packed space, everything is close to everything else, sharing walls, sharing power supplies, sharing the same few operators reading the same few instruments. The complexity is not a flaw in the design. The complexity is what the design is. That alone would not be enough to guarantee catastrophe. A system can be fiendishly complex and still be safe if it has one saving quality. Time, slack room to stop and figure out what is happening before it kills you. A research laboratory is complex. A university is complex. But when something strange happens in a university, you can pause, convene, investigate, try something, undo it if it does not work. The pieces are loosely connected. A problem in one part does not instantly become a problem in every part. Which brings us to Perrow's second idea, and this is the one that turns complexity from an inconvenience into a death sentence. He called it tight coupling. Tight coupling means there is no slack. It means processes happen on a schedule the machine sets, not one you can negotiate. It means there is only one way to get from here to there. No substitutions, no improvising. It means that when something fails in one place, the failure propagates to the next place immediately, before anyone can isolate it, before anyone can even understand it. In a tightly coupled system, you cannot buy time, because time is exactly the thing the system does not give you. The reactor did not wait for the operators to understand it. The water was leaving whether they understood it or not. The core was heating whether they understood it or not. The clock was the machine's clock, and it did not care that the men in the room were still reasoning from a false picture. And here is the sentence that is the whole book. Neither one of these things, by itself, produces the disaster. A system that is complex but loosely coupled gives you strange, surprising failures, but it gives you time to catch them, so they rarely become catastrophes. A system that is tightly coupled but linear fails fast, but it fails in ways you can see coming and design against, because the interactions are all on the diagram. It is only when a system is both, only when it is complex enough to generate failures nobody predicted, and tightly coupled enough that those failures race through it faster than any human being can comprehend them, that you get the thing Perrow was naming, a failure you did not expect, that you cannot understand in time, that you cannot stop from spreading. He plotted these two qualities on a chart, complexity on one axis and coupling on the other, and in the corner, where both were maximal, he placed the systems that would produce accidents, no matter what anyone did. And the very first thing sitting in that corner, the purest example he had, was the nuclear power plant. This is why he called them normal accidents. Not because they happen often, they do not. He was very clear about this, and it is the most misunderstood thing about the whole theory, so hold on to it. A normal accident might occur once in the entire operating life of a plant, or never in any single plant, and still be normal in his sense, because normal here does not mean frequent, It means inherent. It means it is a natural property of this kind of system to produce this kind of failure eventually. He compared it to death. It is normal for us to die, he wrote, but we only do it once. The accident is not an intruder in the system. It is a resident. It lives there, in the wiring, and it comes out when the specific combination comes up. And the only real question is when. Now sit with what that does to the idea of operator error. For as long as there have been machines, there has been a comforting ritual after every disaster. You find the human who was closest to the controls at the moment of failure, and you decide that they did something wrong, and you fix that, and you feel better. Perrow went looking at the actual numbers on this and found that something like 60 to 80% of major accidents in complex technologies get officially attributed to operator error, 6 or 7 out of every 10. And his response to that number was not to defend operators out of sentiment. It was something colder and more devastating. He said that operator error is very often a judgment made by people with perfect hindsight about people who were working with terrible foresight. The investigator sits in a quiet room months later, knowing exactly what was really happening, and looks at what the operator did, and cannot understand why the operator did not see the obvious. But it was not obvious. It was the opposite of obvious. It was hidden behind a dark light and a lying gauge, and the confident trained expectation that instruments tell the truth. The operator built the only coherent picture the available information allowed, and acted on it correctly, and we call that error because the alternative. Admitting that the system put a competent human being in an impossible position and then blamed him for failing is unbearable. He even suspected there was a class dimension to it, that investigators, often engineers and managers, found it easy to believe the man at the console had failed, and hard to believe the elegant system they had designed was the problem. The operator is low status. The design is somebody's career. Blaming the operator protects the system, protects the industry, protects the idea that the technology is fundamentally safe and only human weakness spoils it. And so the man at the console becomes the sacrifice that lets everyone keep believing. This is the first thing the theory takes from you, and it is worth naming plainly. The story you have been told your whole life, that disasters happen because someone messed up, and that the answer is better people, more training, more discipline, more attention, is for this class of system a fairy tale. Not because operators never make mistakes, they do, but because the accidents that define these systems, the ones Perrow was writing about, are precisely the ones that happen when nobody makes a mistake, when everyone does their job correctly and the system eats itself anyway. Which raises the obvious next move. Fine, if the problem is that these systems fail in ways humans cannot catch in time, then we engineer the humans out of the critical loop. We add safety systems. We add redundancy. We add backups and interlocks and automatic shutdowns and warning lights, layers upon layers, so that no single failure can ever cause a disaster, and the machine can catch what the human cannot. Perrow looked at that solution, the solution the entire safety industry was built on, the solution that sounds not just reasonable, but obviously correct, and he found that it was, under the right conditions, the thing that causes the accident. To understand why, you have to understand what a safety system actually is, physically, in a plant. It is not magic. It is more parts. More valves, more sensors, more pumps, more wiring, more logic, more things that can be in the wrong state at the wrong moment. Every safety device you add to protect against one failure is itself a new component, with its own ways of failing, and, more dangerously, its own new ways of interacting with everything already there. You wanted to reduce the number of things that could go wrong. What you actually did was increase the number of things that exist, and therefore the number of hidden pathways between them. You made the system more complex, and complexity, remember, is one of the 2 ingredients of the disaster. Perrow put it in a line that I think about more than almost anything else in the book. He noted, almost in passing, the particular horror of the safety systems that fail silently. Most warning systems, he wrote, do not warn us that they can no longer warn us. Read that again slowly. You install a device whose entire job is to tell you when something is wrong. But the device is a component, and components fail, and when this one fails, it does not announce its own death. It just goes quiet. And now you are worse off than if you had never installed it, because you are trusting a guardian that is no longer there, sleeping soundly under the protection of an alarm that will never ring again. The dark light at 3 Mile Island was exactly this. It was a safety indicator that had, in effect, stopped being able to tell the truth and gave no sign that it had stopped. There is a second, subtler way that safety systems cause the accidents they were meant to prevent, and Perrow was ahead of his time in seeing it. When you know a system has redundancy, when you know there are 3 backups behind every critical function, you behave differently. You run the plant a little harder because you feel protected. You defer a repair because there is a backup covering it. You accept a small risk you would never accept if it were the only thing standing between you and disaster. Because it is not the only thing. There are layers. The redundancy does not just sit there passively catching failures. It changes the behavior of the people around it. It licenses them to push closer to the edge, because the net is there. And so the very margin of safety you built gets consumed, quietly, by the increased boldness it produces, until you are running right at the edge again. Except now the system underneath you is more complex than it has ever been. This is one of the deepest and most uncomfortable ideas in the whole theory, and it generalizes far beyond nuclear plants, so let me state it in its full brutality. In a complex, tightly coupled system, adding safety can reduce safety. Not always, not necessarily, but often enough, and by a mechanism direct enough, that the intuition every regulator and engineer starts with, more safety equipment equals more safety, is not reliably true. Sometimes the safest thing you could do to a dangerous system is make it simpler, take things out, loosen it, give the humans more room and fewer gadgets. And almost nobody does that, because it looks like doing less, and no manager was ever promoted for removing a safety system, and no politician ever won an election promising fewer backups on the reactor. Now let me build you the picture Perrow drew, because it is the thing that turns this from a story about one plant into a map of the modern world, and once you have the map, you will not be able to put it down. Picture a square. Along the bottom, running left to right, is coupling. On the left, loose. On the right, tight. Up the side, running bottom to top, is complexity of interaction. At the bottom, linear. At the top, complex. Every technology, every organization, every system human beings build sits somewhere on that square. And where it sits tells you what kind of danger it carries. Down in the bottom left corner, loose and linear, you have the safe stuff. A trade school, a post office. Most ordinary manufacturing, where the steps are sequential and visible and there is slack in the schedule. When these fail, they fail gently and comprehensibly. Nobody writes a book about the catastrophic potential of a post office. Move to the bottom right, tight but still linear. Now you have things like dams and some kinds of rail transport and parts of the power grid. These are tightly coupled. When a dam fails, there is no slack. The water does not wait. But the interactions are mostly linear, mostly on the diagram. So while these systems can produce disasters, the disasters tend to be the kind you can foresee and design against. You know exactly how a dam fails. You just have to make sure it does not. Move to the top left. Complex but loose. Universities, research and development labs, some government bureaucracies. Wildly complex, full of hidden interactions and unexpected connections, but loosely coupled, full of slack. So the strange failures that complexity generates have time to be noticed and absorbed before they cascade. These systems are maddening. They are not, usually, lethal, and then there is the top right corner. Complex and tightly coupled, both at once, at the maximum. And this is the corner where Perrow placed the things that would, in his judgment, inevitably produce catastrophe. Nuclear power plants, right in the extreme corner. Nuclear weapons and their command systems. Chemical and petrochemical plants. Aircraft and the air traffic system. Space missions. And, in a chapter that reads now like prophecy, the earliest recombinant genetic engineering. What all of these share is the fatal combination. They are complex enough to generate failures nobody planned, and tight enough that those failures propagate faster than anyone can respond. In that corner, the normal accident lives, not as a possibility, as a resident. The reason this matters, the reason it is not just an academic exercise in sorting industries into boxes, is what it implies about fixing them, because the two axes call for opposite cures, and no system can take both at once. Think about what tight coupling demands from the people running a system. When failures propagate instantly, you cannot have operators improvising, trying things, going off script, because an untested action in a tightly coupled system can cascade before anyone knows it was a mistake. Tight coupling demands centralization. It demands that everyone follow the tested approved procedure exactly, that authority sit at the top, that nobody at the console take a creative risk, because there is no slack to absorb a creative risk that goes wrong. Now think about what interactive complexity demands, when the system throws a failure nobody predicted. A combination that is not in any procedure because nobody imagined it. The only hope is an operator on the spot who understands the system deeply and can improvise, can diagnose something novel, can act on their own judgment, because there is no rule for this situation. There could not be. It was never anticipated. Interactive complexity demands decentralization. It demands that the person closest to the problem have the authority and the understanding to respond to something no manual covers. Centralization and decentralization. Obey the procedure exactly and improvise brilliantly. At the same time, in the same crisis, a complex, tightly coupled system needs its operators to be rigidly obedient because of the coupling, and creatively autonomous because of the complexity, and these are not two settings on a dial you can balance. They are contradictory demands, and Perrow's conclusion was that such a system cannot be run well, not because the people are inadequate, but because there is no organizational form that satisfies both requirements. You will always be too centralized for the complexity, or too decentralized for the coupling. The structure itself is asking for something impossible. At 3 Mile Island you can see both horns of that contradiction in the same night. The operators throttled back the emergency cooling because they were following procedure, obeying the centralized rule against going solid. That is the coupling talking, demanding obedience. And what they actually needed in that moment was for someone to look at the whole strange picture, distrust the instruments, and improvise a diagnosis that no procedure contained. That is the complexity talking, demanding autonomy. They could not do both. Nobody could. The system had set a trap that no way of organizing human beings could have escaped, because the trap was built from two requirements that cancel each other out. I want to correct something here, because this is the point where the popular version of 3 Mile Island gets it exactly backwards, and correcting it is the whole game. The story you usually hear is that 3 Mile Island was a near miss, caused by poorly trained operators who panicked, and that the lesson was better training and better simulators, which the industry then dutifully improved. And it is true that training improved. But if you think that training fixed the underlying problem, you have missed everything Perrow was trying to tell you. Better training makes operators better at the situations you can anticipate and rehearse. The normal accident is by definition the situation you did not anticipate, the combination that was not in the simulator because nobody imagined it. You cannot train someone for the specific unforeseeable interaction, because if you could foresee it well enough to train for it, you would have designed it out. Training helps with the accidents that are not normal accidents. Against the normal accident, the one built into the wiring, A better trained operator is a better informed passenger on a machine that is still capable of eating itself. That is the trap the whole safety enterprise keeps walking into. Every response to a normal accident, more training, more procedures, more safety systems, more redundancy, more oversight, is a response calibrated for a component failure world, a world where accidents come from a part breaking or a person slipping. And every one of those responses, applied to a complex, tightly coupled system, either fails to touch the real problem or actively deepens it by adding complexity. You are bringing a fire extinguisher to a flood, and worse, the extinguisher is made of water. But at this point, you might reasonably push back. Fine, nuclear plants are terrifying, chemical plants blow up. This is a story about a few exotic and obviously dangerous technologies that we always knew were playing with fire. Most of life is not a reactor. Where is the part that touches me? Here is where it stops being about reactors. Because Perrow did not stop at the plants. He went looking for the same signature, complexity plus coupling, in systems that carry no radiation and split no atoms, and he found it in the most ordinary catastrophes imaginable. He found it in the sky. He found it at sea. He found it in a lake in Louisiana on an afternoon when a drilling crew made one small mistake and the ground opened up and swallowed everything. And the reason it happened is the same reason the reactor drained, and once you see the pattern in those stories, you will start seeing it in your own. Start in the sky on the 25th of May, 1979, 2 months after 3 Mile Island at Chicago O'Hare. A DC-10, American Airlines Flight 1981, began its takeoff roll. As it lifted off, the engine on the left wing tore away from the aircraft, flipped up and over the wing, and fell to the runway. That alone should have been survivable. The DC-10 was designed to fly on 2 engines. Losing one on takeoff is an emergency, but it is a trained for emergency, and a competent crew can handle it. The pilots did, in fact, exactly what they were trained to do. But the engine did not leave quietly. As it ripped free, it severed hydraulic lines running through the wing, and that severing did 3 things at once. It caused the slats on the leading edge of the left wing to retract, changing the shape of that wing so it would stall at a higher speed than the right wing. It knocked out the warning system that would have told the crew the slats had moved. And it knocked out the stall warning system that would have told them the left wing was about to stop flying. The official investigation, and Perrow quotes this almost reverently because it is his entire thesis written by someone else, concluded that each of these failures by itself would not have caused a qualified crew to lose the aircraft. It was the combination. The wing was misconfigured, and the 2 systems that would have told the crew about it were both dead, killed by the same event that misconfigured the wing. The pilots then did the correct thing for the situation they could see, which was to slow to the normal safe climb speed after losing an engine. And that correct action, at that speed, with that hidden wing configuration they had no way of knowing about, stalled the left wing and rolled the aircraft into the ground. 273 people died, 271 aboard, and 2 more on the ground. At the time, it was the deadliest aviation accident ever to occur on American soil. Look at the shape of it. It is 3 Mile Island with wings. Multiple failures, none fatal alone, cascading through hidden connections faster than any human could untangle. And at the centre of it a crew doing the correct thing based on the information they had, which was the wrong thing because the information had been corrupted by the accident itself. The warning systems that would have saved them were casualties of the same failure they were meant to warn about. The safety devices died in the accident they existed to prevent, and the crew flew a correct procedure straight into the earth. You cannot fix that with a better pilot, the board said so directly. A qualified crew. The problem was not in the cockpit. The problem was in the way an engine, a wing, a hydraulic line, and 2 warning systems were coupled together so tightly that one mechanical event could reach through all of them at once, and rearrange the aircraft into something that could not be flown. But Perrow's most original chapter, the one that I think best reveals how deep this goes, was not about aircraft or reactors. It was about ships. And ships taught him something that should change how you think about technology forever, because it is the exact opposite of the story we tell ourselves about progress. There is something strange about how ships collide. You would assume that two ships crash into each other because neither one saw the other coming. That is the intuitive picture. Fog, darkness, blindness, collision, and so the obvious fix, the fix that seems too obvious to even state, is to give ships better vision. Give them radar. Let them see each other in the fog. Problem solved. Except that is not what happened when radar arrived. Perrow examined the pattern of collisions and found something that genuinely disturbed him. A great many ship collisions are what he called non-collision course collisions. Two ships that were not in fact on a path to hit each other. They were going to pass safely, and then each one became aware of the other, and each one took action to increase the safety margin, and their two independent, reasonable, safety-seeking maneuvers combined to put them on a collision course that did not exist until they tried to avoid it. Each captain did something sensible. The interaction of two sensible actions was the disaster. Nobody was on a collision course until the effort to be safe created one, and radar, the great safety improvement, made this worse, not better. Perrow documented what came to be understood as the radar-assisted collision. Before radar, in fog, a prudent captain slowed to a crawl, posted lookouts, sounded the horn, and crept through blind and terrified, and therefore careful. After radar, that same captain could see, or believed he could see, and so he kept his speed up in conditions where he used to slow down, confident that the screen would show him any danger. The safety technology did not get used to add a margin of safety. It got used to go faster in worse conditions while feeling just as safe as before. The margin the radar created was immediately spent on speed. And now you had ships moving fast through fog, reading each other's positions off screens that update on a delay, making high-speed avoidance maneuvers based on where the other ship was several sweeps ago, and colliding at velocities that would have been unthinkable in the age of the horn and the lookout. This is the same mechanism as the redundant reactor run a little harder because of the backups. It is the same mechanism as every safety improvement that gets converted not into safety, but into performance. You give people a safer car and they drive faster. You give them anti-lock brakes and they follow closer. The safety gain is real, and then human behaviour reaches out and claims it. Spends it on going faster or closer or harder, until the risk settles back to roughly where the person was comfortable in the first place. The technology moved, the felt danger did not. And in a tightly coupled complex system, that traded away margin is exactly the slack that might have saved you. I want you to notice what this does to the idea of progress, because this is the second foreshadow of where this whole story is going, and I need you to hold it now so it lands later. We tell ourselves a story about technology in which every improvement makes us safer. Better instruments, better materials, better automation, better information, every year a little more control over a slightly tamer world. And Perrow's ships tell you that story is at best half true and at worst backwards. Because the improvements do not just make the system safer, they make it more capable, and a more capable system gets used closer to its limits, and a system used closer to its limits with more moving parts is more complex and more tightly coupled than the cruder system it replaced. The improvement and the danger arrive in the same package. The very things we point to as evidence that we are getting safer, more automation, more integration, more speed, more information moving faster between more connected parts, are the things that push a system up and to the right on Perrow's chart, toward the corner where the normal accident lives. Progress is not moving us away from that corner. A great deal of what we call progress is the engine driving us into it. Remember that. because in a while I am going to show you that nearly every critical system your life depends on has spent the last 40 years being optimized, integrated and accelerated, and I am going to ask you what direction the optimization has been moving it on the chart, and you already know the answer. But let me finish the case files first, because there is one more that I cannot stop thinking about. And it happened on a lake. On the 20th of November 1980, on Lake Peigneur in Louisiana, a Texaco oil rig was drilling down through the water and into the earth below. Beneath that lake, though, was a salt mine, an active one, with miners working in it. The drilling crew, through a miscalculation, drilled into the mine, and what happened next is one of the strangest disasters of the 20th century. The hole they had punched let the lake begin draining into the mine. The water, rushing into the salt, dissolved it and widened the hole, which let more water in, which dissolved more salt, a runaway process that fed on itself. The entire lake drained into the earth. The drainage was so violent it reversed the flow of a canal connecting the lake to the Gulf of Mexico, creating a temporary waterfall taller than anything in that flat country had ever seen. Barges were sucked down into the whirlpool. The rig itself was swallowed. The lake, which had been fresh water, refilled with salt water from the Gulf and became a different lake entirely. What Perrow saw in Lake Peigneur was not just the runaway physical process, though that is a textbook tight coupling cascade, one small breach feeding a self-amplifying catastrophe with no slack to stop it. What he saw was the human structure around it. Because there was not one organisation running that system, there was the drilling company and the mining company, and the people who ran the canal, and each of them understood their own piece, and none of them understood the coupled whole. The drillers did not have a clear picture of exactly where the mine was. The miners did not know a drill was coming. Nobody owned the interaction between the lake and the mine and the drill, because in the org chart there was no such thing as the interaction. It fell between the boxes. And the disaster came precisely out of the space between the boxes, the coupling that connected systems that on paper had nothing to do with each other and in reality shared the same few hundred feet of earth. That is the organisational face of interactive complexity. It is not only that the parts of a machine interact in hidden ways, it is that the human beings responsible for those parts are divided into separate organisations, separate budgets, separate chains of command, each optimizing their own piece, none of them holding the whole in their head, so that the hidden interactions between the parts correspond to nobody's job. The catastrophe happens in the seam. And modern life is nothing but seams. Every critical system you depend on is run by dozens of organizations that each control a piece, and none of which controls the coupling, because the coupling is not a thing anyone sells or owns or is paid to watch. The case files all point the same way. You cannot inspect your way out, because the failure is in interactions no inspection anticipates. You cannot train your way out, because the crew is being asked to obey and improvise at the same time. You cannot engineer your way out, because every safety device you add makes the system more complex. And you cannot organise your way out, because the disaster lives in the seams between the organisations, and no reorganisation ever eliminates the seams, it only moves them. Every lever we normally reach for is the wrong lever, which leaves an obvious and desperate question. Is there anyone who has actually beaten this? Is there any system this complex and this tightly coupled that has run for decades without eating itself? Because if there is, then Perrow is wrong, or at least incomplete, and there is a way out after all. And it turns out there is a set of researchers who went looking for exactly that, who found systems that should, by Perrow's logic, be producing catastrophes, and were not. And for a while, they thought they had found the escape. They were based mostly at Berkeley, a group of researchers whose names deserve to be known: Todd Laporte, Gene Rocklin, Carlene Roberts, and they came at the problem from the opposite direction than Perrow did. Perrow started with disasters and asked why they were inevitable. These researchers started with systems that were not having disasters and asked how they managed it. They went and embedded themselves in some of the most dangerous operations on Earth to find out. They studied the air traffic control system, which juggles thousands of aircraft in the same sky every hour and almost never lets two of them touch. They studied a nuclear power operation. And most famously, they went aboard the nuclear aircraft carrier, which is arguably the most hostile, complex, tightly coupled environment human beings have ever chosen to work in on purpose. Picture the flight deck of a carrier during operations. Aircraft landing and taking off from the same short strip of steel, jet blast and arresting cables and live ordnance, and a nuclear reactor below decks, and hundreds of young people, many of them 19 or 20 years old, moving through a choreography where a single misstep means someone gets pulled into an intake, or blown off the deck, or crushed. By every measure on Perrow's chart, this is the corner of death. Interactive complexity at the maximum, coupling so tight that the deck operates on a clock measured in seconds. It should, by the theory, be a machine that eats itself. And it does not. Carriers run for years, through hundreds of thousands of operations, with a safety record that, given the conditions, is genuinely hard to believe. These researchers asked the question that had to be asked. If Perrow is right that catastrophe is guaranteed in this corner, how is this thing not a smoking hole in the ocean? And out of that question they built a rival theory, which came to be called High Reliability Organization Theory, and it is the most serious intellectual challenge Perrow's ideas ever faced. What they found on the carrier was a culture, not a technology. They found that safety was genuinely the top priority, above efficiency, above schedule, in a way that was constantly reinforced and believed all the way down to the newest sailor. They found that anyone, literally anyone, any teenager on that deck, had the authority to halt flight operations if they saw something wrong, and would be thanked for it even if they turned out to be mistaken, because a false alarm was treated as cheap and a missed hazard as unthinkable. They found relentless, continuous training and a kind of collective wariness, an organizational refusal to ever feel safe, a culture that treated every quiet day as luck that could run out. They found redundancy used not as an excuse to relax, but as a genuine backup watched by people who assumed the primary would fail. They found decentralized decision-making in a crisis, authority flowing down to whoever was closest to the problem, exactly the autonomy that interactive complexity demands. And the conclusion they drew was hopeful, and it was a direct shot at Perrow. Catastrophe is not inevitable. Some organizations, with the right culture, the right priorities, the right relationship to failure, can operate the most dangerous systems imaginable for decades without the normal accident ever arriving. It can be beaten. It is being beaten right now on a boat in the Pacific. I have to be honest with you about this, because the whole value of what we are doing here is that it does not flinch. This is a real challenge, and the evidence is real. The carrier does not blow up. Air traffic control does keep the planes apart. There are systems in Perrow's death corner that have run clean for a very long time, and the people who studied them found specific, describable practices that seem to explain why. If you wanted to argue that Perrow was too pessimistic, that he mistook a difficult problem for an impossible one, this is where you would plant your flag, and it is not a weak place to stand. Perrow's response to this, over the years the two schools argued, was not to deny the carriers existed. It was sharper than that. He argued first that the systems the reliability researchers studied might not actually be as tightly coupled as they looked. A carrier can, in the end, stop flight operations. It can wave off a landing, hold aircraft in the air, slow the whole tempo down when things get strange. It has a kind of slack that a reactor in a runaway does not. You can loosen the coupling on a flight deck in a way you cannot loosen it inside a core that is already boiling dry. And second, and this is the harder point, he argued that the absence of catastrophe over a period of decades does not prove catastrophe is impossible. It might just prove you have not waited long enough. The normal accident, by definition, is rare. The system could run clean for 50 years and still be carrying the resident, still be one unlucky combination away from the disaster that was always in its wiring. Decades of safety and inevitability are not contradictory. They are exactly what the theory predicts, right up until the day they are not. And here is where the argument stops being academic and becomes something that should make the hair on your arms stand up. Because there is one system in Perrow's death corner where we cannot afford to wait and see, where the first normal accident is also the last, and where the reliability researchers and Perrow both knew the stakes were total. Nuclear weapons, the command and control systems that stand between an ordinary Tuesday and the end of the world. And a political scientist named Scott Sagan decided to settle the argument by going into that system's history and finding out from the declassified record how close we had actually come. His book came out in 1993. It is called The Limits of Safety, and it is one of the most quietly terrifying works of scholarship I have ever encountered. Because Sagan did something very disciplined. He did not go looking for scare stories. He set up the two theories, Perrow's and the reliability schools, as competing predictions. And then he went into the archives of the American nuclear command system during the Cold War to see which prediction the actual history matched. Nuclear Weapons Command should be the ultimate high-reliability organization, if any system on Earth has safety as its absolute overriding priority. Backed by unlimited money and the full seriousness of the state, it is the one built to prevent an accidental nuclear war. If the reliability school is right, this system should be nearly flawless, and what Sagan found in the record was a long hidden history of near misses that the public had never been told about. A parade of moments where the system that was supposed to be the safest thing ever built came far closer to killing everyone than anyone had admitted. Let me give you two of them, because the details are the thing. On the 9th of November, 1979, the computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the nerve center that watches for a Soviet attack, suddenly showed a massive incoming strike. Missiles inbound. The full attack. The response machinery began to move. Interceptor aircraft were scrambled. The command post that would let the leadership run a nuclear war from the air was readied. For a few minutes, the American military believed it was watching the beginning of the end and began to react as it had trained to react. And the cause, when they finally traced it, was that a training tape, a simulation of exactly this scenario, a drill designed to practice for a Soviet attack, had somehow been loaded into the live warning system. The system could not tell the difference between the rehearsal and the real thing. The fiction of the attack had been fed into the machine, whose job was to detect the fact of an attack, and the machine reported the fiction as fact, and the response began. If that were the only one, you could call it a fluke. It was not the only one. On the 3rd of June, 1980, less than a year later, the warning system did it again, and this time the cause was almost insulting in its smallness. The displays at command centers began showing Soviet missiles inbound. The numbers on the screen were changing, climbing, the count of incoming warheads rising. According to the accounts that later emerged, the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was woken in the middle of the night and told that a large number of Soviet missiles, more than 2,000 of them by one report, had been launched at the United States. In the memoir of Robert Gates, who was a senior intelligence official at the time, there is a detail that I cannot get out of my head. Brzezinski told that the missiles were coming and that he had minutes to advise the president on a response that would kill much of humanity, reportedly chose not to wake his sleeping wife because he preferred that she die in her sleep rather than know. He sat there in the dark, believing the world was ending, waiting to make the call. And the cause of it, the thing that put those 2,000 Phantom missiles on the screen, and a man in the dark deciding to let his wife sleep through the apocalypse, was a failed computer chip. A single defective integrated circuit, worth about 46 cents, generating garbage data that the warning system displayed as an all-out Soviet first strike. 46 cents. That was the distance, on that night, between an ordinary June and the launch order. Sagan's conclusion from the whole record was measured and all the more devastating for it. He found that the nuclear command system had been kept safe not primarily by good design, but by good luck. Again and again the near misses were caught, but they were often caught by chance, by an individual who happened to hesitate, by a corroborating system that happened to disagree, by the accident happening to occur at a moment of low tension rather than high. The safety was real, but it was fragile, and a disturbing amount of it came down to fortune rather than to the flawless design the reliability school would predict. The system that had every incentive on earth to be perfectly safe, that had all the money and all the seriousness and all the priority, was riddled with exactly the interactive complexity and tight coupling failures Perrow described, and had survived them not because it was too well built to fail, but because the failures kept, so far, being caught in time. Perrow himself said that Sagan had taken the study of accidents out of the hands of the engineers and economists and put it where it belonged, in the hands of people who understood organizations. Because the weapons had not saved us. The organization, and beneath the organization, luck had. Think about what that means as a verdict on the reliability school's hope. The most safety-obsessed system ever constructed did not defeat the normal accident. It just kept getting lucky. And luck is not a safety feature. Luck is the thing you are relying on when you have run out of actual safety, and it is the one thing that by its nature eventually runs out. And so the escape hatch closes. The carriers do not prove catastrophe is beatable. They prove that with enough obsession and enough slack, you can push the accident off, maybe for a very long time, but pushing it off is not the same as removing it, and the one system where we most needed it removed turns out to have survived on a coin flip that kept so far landing the right way up. And that was during the Cold War. With a small number of nuclear-armed states and human beings in every critical loop and decades to learn each system slowly. And I have not even told you the worst part of the timing yet, which is what happened to the book itself once it was out in the world. Because Perrow published Normal Accidents in 1984, and the world did not politely wait to test his argument. It began confirming it almost immediately, in a sequence of disasters so on point that if you put them in a novel, an editor would tell you to cut them for being too neat. The book had been on the shelves for a matter of months, when, on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of December, 1984, a pesticide plant run by Union Carbide in Bhopal, India, released a cloud of methyl isocyanate gas over a sleeping city. Methyl isocyanate is a chemical you do not want to know the effects of. Water had gotten into a storage tank where it never should have been, and it set off a runaway reaction, heat and pressure building with nowhere to go, and the gas vented out over the shanties and streets, where hundreds of thousands of people were asleep. The death toll has never been settled, and the estimates run from several thousand in the immediate aftermath to many times that in the years that followed, one of the worst industrial disasters that has ever occurred. And when you look at how it happened, it is Perrow's chapter on chemical plants brought to hideous life. A complex, tightly coupled system in the fatal corner of the chart. And the safety systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this. The refrigeration that should have kept the tank cold, the scrubber that should have neutralized escaping gas, the flare tower that should have burned it off, were variously undersized, switched off, or not working, some of them shut down to save money. So that when the interaction came the layers of protection that existed on. Paper were not there in reality. The redundancy was a fiction. The margins had been optimized away. And the accident came through the space the missing margins left open. But the disaster that reads most like a message written directly to Perrow, the one I find almost unbearable in how perfectly it proves the thesis, came a year and a half later, on the 26th of April, 1986, at a nuclear plant in the Soviet Union called Chernobyl. You know the name. What you may not know is what the operators were actually doing at the moment the reactor destroyed itself. They were running a safety test. Read that again, because it is the whole book in a single fact. The worst nuclear accident in the history of the world happened because a crew was conducting a test of a safety system. The test was meant to answer a reasonable question. If the plant lost outside power, there would be a gap of some seconds before the backup diesel generators came up to speed and restored the cooling pumps. And the engineers wanted to know whether the spinning momentum of the slowing turbines could bridge that gap, could power the pumps for those few seconds until the generators caught up. A sensible thing to want to verify. To run the test, the operators had to bring the reactor to a low, unstable power level, and to keep it there and keep the test going, they disabled and overrode a series of the reactor's automatic safety systems, one after another, because those safety systems, doing their job, kept trying to interfere with the abnormal conditions the test required. And this particular reactor design had a vicious hidden property, a way of interacting with itself that the operators were not fully briefed on, where under certain low power conditions a small increase in power could cause a change in the cooling water that caused a further increase in power. A runaway feedback loop coiled inside the physics of the machine, waiting for exactly the conditions the safety test had created. When it triggered, the power spiked thousands of times over in seconds, faster than any control rod could answer, and the reactor tore itself apart and burned and threw its core across a continent. A test of a safety system, requiring the safety systems to be switched off, triggering a hidden interaction the operators did not know was there, cascading faster than any human could respond. Interactive complexity, the concealed feedback loop between power and cooling that nobody in that room fully understood. Tight coupling, a runaway that outran every possible intervention in seconds. And the safety system as the direct cause, not as a failed guardian this time, but as the literal activity that initiated the catastrophe. They were making the reactor safer when they destroyed it. Perrow, in a later edition of the book, wrote about Chernobyl, and he made the point plainly. The tests of a new safety system had helped produce the meltdown. The thing built to prevent the disaster was the occasion of it. There is no purer statement of his entire argument, and history handed it to him for free, less than 2 years after he had explained the mechanism in advance. And the same year, in a completely different kind of system, it happened again, in a way that showed the organizational face of the theory rather than the physical one. On the 28th of January, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 people aboard, because of the failure of a rubber sealing ring in one of the solid rocket boosters, a seal that lost its flexibility in the unusually cold weather that morning and let hot gas burn through. And the thing that makes Challenger a Perrow story, rather than a simple story of a broken part, is that the engineers who built those boosters knew about the risk. They had warned about it. On the night before the launch, some of them argued against flying in that cold, but the warning had to travel up through an organization under intense schedule pressure, across the seam between the engineers who understood the physics and the managers who owned the calendar, and in that seam the warning was softened and questioned and finally overridden, and the launch went ahead. The knowledge existed. It just did not reach the decision with enough force to stop it, because the structure between the knowledge and the decision was built in a way that let schedule pressure win. The catastrophe happened in the seam between the people who knew and the people who chose, exactly like the space between the drillers and the miners at Lake Panier. Exactly like every disaster where the danger lived in a connection that corresponded to nobody's job. 3 disasters, in 2 years, in 3 completely different technologies, on 2 continents and in orbit, each one confirming a different face of the same argument a man had published just before they happened. A chemical plant whose safety margins had been optimized into fiction. A reactor destroyed by the test of its own safety system. A shuttle lost in the seam between knowledge and authority. Perrow did not have to go looking for evidence. The evidence came looking for him, on schedule the way the theory said it would. That is not the world you live in now. The world you live in now took Perrow's death corner and moved almost everything into it. Start with the thing you plug your life into. The electrical grid. On the 14th of August, 2003, at a little after 4 in the afternoon, the largest blackout in North American history rolled across the northeast of the continent and shut off the power for around 50 million people, across Ohio, Michigan, New York, and up into Ontario in a matter of minutes. 50 million, and when the investigators reconstructed how it happened, the story was so precisely Perrow's story that you could use it as a worked example in a textbook. It began small, the way they always do. Some overgrown trees in Ohio that a utility had failed to trim, a few power lines that sagged in the summer heat, as heavily loaded lines do, and touched those trees and tripped offline. That is a routine event. The grid loses lines all the time and reroutes around them. It should have been nothing. But two things turned nothing into a continental collapse. First, in the control room of the utility that owned those lines, the alarm system had silently failed. A software flaw, a subtle timing bug in the program that ran the control room, had crashed the alarms without crashing anything visible, so the operators sat there watching screens that were no longer telling them the truth, unaware that the tool whose job was to warn them had stopped being able to warn them. There is that sentence again. The warning system did not warn them that it could no longer warn them. 1984, written down, playing out in an Ohio control room 19 years later, exactly as described. And second, the grid is tightly coupled in a way that is physically unavoidable, because electricity moves at nearly the speed of light, and the whole interconnected network shares one synchronized heartbeat. When those first lines dropped, the power they had been carrying did not disappear. It rerouted onto neighbouring lines, which were now more heavily loaded, which sagged further, which tripped, which pushed their load onto the next lines, which tripped. Once the cascade began, it moved faster than any human being could act. Power surged and reversed direction across whole states in seconds. 265 power plants shut down, many of them automatically disconnecting to protect themselves, which was the correct thing for each plant to do, and which deepened the collapse for the whole. The official investigation stated the thing that matters most plainly. Once a cascade like this begins, it cannot be stopped by human intervention. It is too fast. The humans are spectators. They watch the network eat itself on their darkening screens, and there is nothing, by the time it starts, that any of them can do. 50 million people in the dark, something like $6 billion in economic damage, at least 11 deaths tied to the blackout. And no villain. A utility that should have trimmed its trees, yes, and a software bug that should have been caught. But the disaster itself, the 50 million person disaster, was not caused by the trees or the bug. It was caused by the way a hidden software failure and a routine line trip combined inside a system so tightly coupled that a local problem became a continental one before anyone understood what was happening. The trees were the cup of water, the rest was the wiring. Now go from the thing you plug in to the thing you keep your money in, because the financial system is, structurally, the purest normal accident machine human beings have ever built, and Perrow saw it coming. In the later editions and later writings, he pointed directly at financial markets as the next great domain for his theory, and then 2008 happened. You know the shape of 2008, even if you never learned the mechanics. What I want you to see is not the greed, though there was plenty, and not the fraud, though there was plenty of that too. Perrow was careful about this, and I will be careful too. The financial crisis was not a pure innocent normal accident in the way the reactor was, because there was genuine malfeasance in it, and he insisted on saying so. But underneath the malfeasance, the reason a problem in one corner of the American mortgage market could nearly bring down the entire global financial system was structure. It was interactive complexity and tight coupling wearing suits. The complexity was in the instruments. Financial engineers had built products of such intricacy, Mortgages bundled and sliced and rebundled and insured and bet upon, that almost nobody, including the people who built and sold them, actually understood how they would behave when conditions changed. The connections between institutions ran through these instruments in ways that were invisible until they mattered, hidden pathways linking banks that thought they had nothing to do with each other. Exactly the non-linear interactions Perrow described in the reactor, now denominated in trillions. And the coupling was in the leverage and the funding. Institutions were so leveraged, so dependent on constant short-term borrowing, so entangled as each other's creditors and counterparties, that there was no slack anywhere. When one large firm failed, the failure did not stay contained. It propagated through the web of obligations instantly, because everyone owed everyone, and the collapse of one node threatened every node connected to it, which was all of them. That is a complex, tightly coupled system producing a system accident. A shock at one point, subprime mortgages, that in a loosely coupled world would have caused localized pain. Instead, raced through hidden interconnections at a speed no regulator could match, threatening to take down the whole structure. And the people running it did not fully understand the instruments or the interconnections, because understanding the coupled whole was once again nobody's job. Each firm optimized its own position. Nobody owned the seam. The catastrophe happened in the seam. Perrow added one more turn to this that I find especially unsettling, and it connects back to the man he was, the lifelong student of power. He argued that the concentration of the financial system into a small number of enormous interconnected institutions was itself a form of tight coupling, and a deliberate one. When you have a handful of firms so large and so entangled that none of them can be allowed to fail, you have built maximum coupling on purpose, in the name of efficiency and scale, and you have done it in the one system where the coupling means a single failure can threaten everything. And the same concentration of power that tightened the coupling also captured the regulators who were supposed to loosen it. The bigness that made the system fragile was the bigness that made it untouchable. This was Perrow's oldest theme, the way organizations grow enormous not because bigness is safe or even efficient, but because it concentrates power, coming back to describe the machine that nearly ended the world economy. But if you want the single cleanest example of a modern normal accident, the one that looks like it was designed in a laboratory to prove Perrow right, it happened in about 36 minutes on the afternoon of the 6th of May, 2010, and it is called the flash crash. Here is what happened, in the detail it deserves. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, a single large trading firm, a mutual fund company, began executing a very large sell order, offloading 75,000 futures contracts, worth roughly $4 billion, as a hedge. They did it through an automated program set to sell at a pace tied to trading volume. On an ordinary day this would have been absorbed, but the market that afternoon was already thin and nervous, and the selling program fed its orders into a market dominated by high-frequency trading algorithms, automated systems that buy and sell in millionths of a second, far faster than any human can follow. Those algorithms bought the contracts being sold, and then, as they tried to offload them, they sold to each other back and forth, a machine passing the same inventory around at superhuman speed, generating enormous volume without absorbing the actual selling pressure. And the selling program, tied to volume, saw all that machine-to-machine trading as volume and sped up its own selling in response. The machine was feeding itself. The faster the algorithms traded, the faster the sell program dumped, which made the algorithms trade faster still. And then, the algorithms did the thing that turned a drop into a void. Sensing conditions they were not built to handle, many of them simply withdrew. They stopped trading, all at once, in unison, because each one independently hit its own limits and pulled out. And when the machines that provide most of the market's liquidity all step back at the same instant, there is suddenly nobody to buy. The prices fell into a vacuum. The broad market dropped about 9% in minutes. The Dow fell close to 1,000 points. Roughly $1 trillion in value evaporated, and individual stocks did things that should have been impossible. shares of major companies trading for a single penny or for $100,000, because with the liquidity gone, the prices lost all connection to reality. And then, about 36 minutes after it began, it reversed, and the market climbed back, and by the end of the day the numbers looked almost normal again, as if the whole thing had been a hallucination. No human decided any of that. That is the point that should stop you cold. There was no panicked trader, no fat-fingered mistake at the centre of it, though those got blamed at first. There was a set of automated systems, each one behaving exactly as designed, interacting at a speed no human could perceive, in a market so tightly coupled that a hedge in one instrument drained the liquidity from thousands of others in minutes. Interactive complexity, the hidden interactions between trading algorithms nobody had mapped, and tight coupling, the millisecond linkages across every venue, combining to produce $1 trillion accident that began and ended faster than a lunch break, caused by no one, understood by no one in real time, and stopped only because some of the automatic circuit breakers, the safety systems, happened to trip and force a pause. We had, in effect, built a market that could destroy $1 trillion of value in half an hour with no human being anywhere in the decision, and we did not know we had built it until it did it, and the researchers who studied it afterward described it in exactly Perrow's language, a normal accident of complex interactions and tight coupling among automated participants. They also noted something that should worry you more than the crash itself. Smaller versions of this, mini flash crashes, happen constantly, on ordinary days, in individual stocks, so often that they barely make the news. The big one in 2010 was not an aberration. It was the visible instance of a thing that is happening all the time, at smaller scales, in a system we have made faster and more automated and more tightly coupled every single year since. Which is the pattern, and it is time to say the pattern out loud, because it is the scandal at the heart of all of this. A man published a book in 1984. In it he laid out, with precision, the exact mechanism by which complex, tightly coupled systems inevitably produce catastrophes that cannot be prevented by training, inspection, regulation, or added safety equipment. He named the mechanism. He drew the map. He told us which corner of the map was fatal. And he told us that the only real way to make a system in that corner safer was to loosen it, to add slack, to decouple it, to make it simpler and more forgiving even at the cost of some efficiency. And then we spent the next 40 years doing the precise opposite, on purpose to everything, and calling it progress. That is the scandal. Not that the knowledge was hidden. The book is right there, cited thousands of times, taught in courses, sitting on the shelves of the very people who run these systems. The scandal is that the knowledge was available and clear, and we built the modern world in direct defiance of it, because every incentive that acts on a system pushes it toward the fatal corner and almost nothing pushes it back. Efficiency pushes toward tight coupling, because slack is waste and buffers cost money, and inventory sitting idle is capital not working. Integration pushes toward complexity, because connecting everything to everything is how you get scale and speed and convenience. Optimization pushes toward both, because an optimized system is one with the slack squeezed out and the parts wound tighter together. And every one of those forces is relentless, is backed by money and competition and the genuine short-term rewards of a faster, cheaper, more connected system, while the only force pushing the other way, towards slack and simplicity and decoupling, is the memory of a disaster that has not happened yet, and the warning of a sociologist most decision-makers have never read. Loosening coupling is the one lever that works, and it is the one lever that every pressure in a competitive economy is designed to pull in the wrong direction. Slack is the first thing efficiency eliminates. A buffer is, by definition, capacity you are not using, and in a world of quarterly numbers, capacity you are not using is a target. Every consultant, every optimization, Every drive to do more with less is a drive to remove exactly the slack that Perrow identified as the only real protection against the normal accident. We are not accidentally tightening these systems. We are tightening them as fast as we can, deliberately, and rewarding the people who tighten them fastest. And the tightening is the thing we mean when we say a system has been improved. You want to see it in its most naked form, watch what happened to the supply chains. For decades, the reigning philosophy of manufacturing was just in time. The idea that holding inventory is waste. That the efficient factory keeps almost nothing in stock, and instead has each part arrive exactly when it is needed, not before. It is brilliant on a spreadsheet. It ties up no capital in warehouses full of waiting parts. It is also, in Perrow's exact terms, the deliberate and total elimination of slack. A just-in-time supply chain is a tightly coupled system by design. Engineered so that there is no buffer anywhere, so that a disruption at any point propagates immediately because there is no cushion of inventory to absorb it. For years this looked like pure genius, because the disruption did not come. And then a virus came, and the whole world watched what a maximally tight supply chain does when it is shocked. It seized. A shortage in one component, made in one region, halted assembly lines on the other side of the planet within weeks, because there was no slack anywhere in the line, no warehouse of spare chips, no buffer of anything, because buffers had been optimized away as waste. Auto plants sat idle for want of semiconductors that in an older, looser, less efficient system would have been sitting in a warehouse somewhere, wastefully, safely. The efficiency that made the system profitable in calm times was the exact same property that made it collapse under stress. They were not two things. They were one thing, seen from two sides. And the lesson people drew from it, the frantic corporate rediscovery of the idea that maybe you should keep some inventory after all, just in case, was nothing but Perrow's prescription arriving 40 years late, and dressed in new jargon. Loosen the coupling. Add slack. Accept some inefficiency to buy some resilience. It is the only thing that works. And we had to nearly break the global economy to remember it, and the moment the crisis passed, the pressure to tighten everything back up returned, because it always returns, because the pressure to tighten is structural and permanent, and the memory of the disaster fades. But the system where all of this comes together, the one that I think Perrow would have found the most complete vindication of everything he argued, happened on the 19th of July, 2024, and you probably lived through it without knowing you were watching a normal accident in real time. A company called CrowdStrike makes security software. Their product runs on millions of computers inside hospitals and banks and airlines and governments, and its job is to protect those computers from attack. To do that job, it runs at the deepest level of the operating system, the kernel, the core, coupled as tightly to the machine as software can be, because that is where it needs to be to catch threats. And on that morning, CrowdStrike pushed out a routine update to its software, the kind of update it pushed constantly, automatically to all of those machines at once. But this update contained a flaw, a mismatch in the code, a logic error that caused the software to reach for a piece of data that was not there. And because the software was running in the kernel, at the very heart of the machine, that error did not just crash the program, it crashed the entire computer instantly into the blue error screen, and then when the computer restarted it, loaded the same broken update and crashed again into an endless loop. Dead, not one computer. Because the update went out automatically to every machine running the software all at once, with no staged rollout. No gradual test on a few machines first, the failure propagated to all of them simultaneously. Microsoft later estimated that around 8.5 million computers were struck, and because those particular computers were running the systems that run the world, the effects were instant and global. Airlines grounded their fleets, thousands of flights cancelled, passengers stranded on every continent, hospitals cancelled surgeries and lost access to records, banks and payment systems went down, television stations went dark, emergency lines failed in places. In a matter of minutes, a single flawed file, pushed automatically into the kernel of millions of tightly coupled machines, took down a meaningful slice of modern civilization's nervous system. And the direct losses to large companies alone were later estimated at more than $5 billion. Now walk through it with Perrow's map in your hand and watch every single element light up. Interactive complexity, software running at the kernel level, coupled to the operating system in ways so intricate that a single malformed file could bring down the whole machine. An interaction the makers plainly did not fully anticipate, or they would have caught it. Tight coupling, an automatic global update pushed to millions of machines at once, with no slack, no buffer, no staged rollout that would have let the failure show up on a few machines before it reached all of them. And the final, perfect bit of detail, the one that Perrow would have circled in red. The software that caused the largest information technology outage in history was security software. It was a safety system. Its entire reason for existing was to protect those machines from catastrophe. And it became the catastrophe, delivered directly into the core of every machine it was guarding by the very automatic mechanism that made it effective. The Guardian was the threat. The safety system was the accident. 1984, one more time, exactly as written, playing out across 8.5 million screens in a single morning. And here is the third time I am going to ask you to hold a thought, because it is the one the whole story has been walking toward, and it is close now. Ask yourself what direction we have been moving. In 1979, the reactor was one plant, run by humans reading dials, tightly coupled within its own walls, but not to much else. By 2003, the disaster spanned a continent because the grid had been coupled together across states and nations. By 2010, the accident spanned the entire financial market because trading had been coupled together across every venue at the speed of light. By 2024, the accident spanned the whole digital infrastructure of civilization because we had coupled our hospitals and airlines and banks and governments to a handful of shared pieces of software pushed automatically to all of them at once. The accidents are not getting smaller, they are getting larger, and they are getting larger for a specific reason. Each decade we couple more of the world together, more tightly, and remove more of the slack between the pieces, so that when the normal accident comes, and it always comes, it has more of the world to travel through, and less to slow it down. We are not just failing to escape Perrow's corner, we are building an on-ramp to it, and merging the whole of modern life onto that ramp, and we are pressing the accelerator, and we are calling the acceleration progress. There is one more coupling left to add. The last human out of the loop. Every system we have looked at still had, somewhere, a human being who could in principle intervene, even if only to watch helplessly as the Cascade outran them. The operators at 3 Mile Island were in the room. The grid operators saw their screens go dark. The traders watched the flash crash on their terminals. The last several decades of coupling removed the slack between the parts, but there was still, at the edges, a person who might catch the thing if only they were fast enough. And the tragedy was usually that they were not fast enough. But the person was there. The loop still closed, in principle, through a human mind. The thing we are doing now, the thing that is happening across finance and infrastructure and logistics and increasingly everywhere at once, is removing that last human. Not out of malice, out of the same relentless efficiency pressure that removed every other buffer. Because a human in the loop is slow, and slow is expensive, and a competitor who takes the human out and lets the machines decide will be faster and cheaper than you, and so the human comes out of the loop for the same reason the inventory came out of the warehouse. It is waste. It is friction. It is slack. And slack is the enemy. The flash crash was a preview of a world where the decisions happen too fast for humans to be part of them, and that world has only accelerated since. More and more of what happens in markets, in supply chains, in the routing of power and data and goods, is decided by automated systems interacting with other automated systems at speeds where human oversight is not slow, it is simply absent. Structurally impossible, because the events begin and end in fractions of a second. And now we are wiring artificial intelligence into these loops, systems more capable than the simple trading algorithms of 2010 and vastly more opaque. Because here is the property of these newer systems that should give you pause in the specific language of everything we have been discussing. We often cannot fully explain why they do what they do. Their internal workings are, even to the people who build them, partly a black box. Which means we are taking the interactive complexity that Perrow warned about, the hidden interactions between parts that operators cannot foresee, and we are installing, as the parts, systems whose behavior is not fully predictable even to their own makers. And we are coupling those systems tightly together and letting them act faster than we can watch. Think about what interactive complexity means when the components themselves are not fully understandable. Perrow's whole theory was about the hidden interactions between parts you did understand individually, valves and pumps and gauges whose individual behavior was known. The danger was in the connections. Now imagine that the parts themselves are partly opaque, that each component can respond to a situation in a way its own designers did not fully anticipate, and then imagine those partly opaque parts coupled tightly to each other, each one reacting to the outputs of the others at machine speed, in a system nobody can pause. You have not just added interactive complexity, you have compounded it, put it on top of components that are already miniature sources of the unforeseeable, and then removed the human who was the last hope of catching the interaction before it cascaded. There is no operator now, there is no dark light for someone to eventually notice, because there is no someone. And the whole thing is moving too fast for a someone to matter even if one were there. And you do not have to imagine what it looks like when we get part way down this road, when the human is still physically present, but the machine has been given the authority to override him, because it has already happened twice in the same aircraft, and it killed 346 people. The Boeing 737 MAX is a passenger jet, a new version of an old and trusted design. To make it more efficient, Boeing fitted it with larger engines, and the larger engines, mounted differently, changed how the plane handled, gave it a tendency to pitch its nose up in certain conditions in a way the older versions did not. Now, the honest engineering fix for a plane that handles differently is to tell the pilots it handles differently and train them on it. But training costs money, and airlines buy planes partly on the promise that their pilots will not need expensive new certification and simulator time, and so there was enormous commercial pressure to make the new plane feel exactly like the old plane, so that no retraining would be required. And to deliver that feeling, Boeing added a piece of software. It was called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, and its job was to automatically push the nose back down when the plane pitched up too far, so that to the pilot, the new aircraft would behave like the familiar one. Here is the coupling. That software, which could command the aircraft to point its nose at the ground, took its reading from a single sensor on the outside of the plane, one sensor with no backup consulted, measuring the angle of the wing to the oncoming air. And the pilots were largely not told the system existed. It was designed to be invisible, because the entire commercial point of it was that the plane should feel like the old plane, which meant the pilot was not supposed to notice anything at all. On the 29th of October 2018, on a Lion Air flight out of Jakarta, that single sensor failed and began reporting a false reading. The software, trusting the one sensor it had, concluded the plane was pitching up dangerously and pushed the nose down. The pilots pulled it back. The software, still reading the bad sensor, pushed it down again. The pilots pulled it back again. Over and over, a man fighting a machine for control of an aircraft, a machine acting on a single false input, a machine the man had never been told was there. Each of them pulling in opposite directions, and the machine had been given enough authority that it kept winning a little more each cycle until the plane went into the sea. Everyone aboard died. And then, because the specific fixable cause was not addressed with enough urgency, because the seam between Boeing and its regulator was one where the company had been allowed to effectively vouch for the safety of its own design, it happened again. On the 10th of March, 2019, an Ethiopian Airlines MAX went down the same way. The same fight between a pilot and a hidden system reading a broken sensor, and everyone aboard died too. Look at what that is. A safety and automation system, added for commercial efficiency, kept invisible so that no expensive retraining would be needed, coupled to a single point of failure, given the authority to override the human being who was sitting right there, trying desperately to save the aircraft. The operator was present. He was trained. He was fighting with everything he had, and the machine, doing exactly what it had been designed to do, using exactly the input it had been designed to trust, calmly overrode him and flew the plane into the ground. This is the intermediate step, the one between the operators of 3 Mile Island who at least had their hands on the controls, and the coming systems where there will be no hands on the controls at all. It is the step where the human is still in the seat, but no longer in command, where the automation added for efficiency has quietly become the thing the human cannot beat. And we have already taken that step in the most safety-regulated industry on Earth, and it took 2 crashes and hundreds of dead before anyone forced the machine to let go of the controls. And you have coupled it all onto shared ground. This is the part people miss, because it is invisible until it fails, exactly like the software bug in the Ohio control room. An enormous fraction of the modern digital world does not run on its own machines. It runs on a small number of shared platforms, a handful of cloud providers, a few pieces of common infrastructure, the same shared services underneath thousands of companies that appear to be separate. On the surface, the app on your phone and your bank and your hospital and the airline all look like independent systems. Underneath, a great many of them are sitting on the same few foundations, coupled to the same shared pieces, so that when one of those foundations has a normal accident, and they do, periodically, a whole swath of the apparently separate world goes down at once, revealing a coupling that was always there and always invisible. CrowdStrike was one version of this. The recurring major outages at the big cloud providers, each one taking down a startling range of seemingly unrelated services for a few hours, are another. Every one of them is the same lesson. What looks like a diverse, redundant, resilient ecosystem of independent systems is, underneath, a small number of shared, tightly coupled foundations, and the diversity is a surface illusion painted over a deep and hidden singularity of failure. I want to be precise here and not overclaim, because the honest version is frightening enough without embellishment. Perrow died in November of 2019, at 94, before the largest of these convergences fully arrived, before the current generation of artificial intelligence, before some of the worst of the outages. He did not write about the specific systems keeping you alive today. What he left us was the map, the 2 axes, the fatal corner, and the mechanism. And the honest thing to say is not that he predicted any specific future disaster. The honest thing to say is worse than a prediction. It is that he handed us the exact criteria for building a catastrophe machine, told us plainly which direction was fatal, and then watched, for the last 35 years of his life, as we optimized every critical system we have straight toward the corner he told us to avoid, faster and faster, removing the humans, sharing the foundations, tightening the coupling, compounding the complexity, and congratulating ourselves at every step for the efficiency of it. He spent his final years, in fact, growing more pessimistic, not less. His later work turned toward the concentration of everything, energy, finance, population, infrastructure, into ever larger and more coupled and more vulnerable targets, and he argued that some systems with catastrophic potential are simply too dangerous to exist, that they cannot be made safe regardless of human effort. and that the sane response is not to run them more carefully but to not build them, or to break them into smaller, looser, more survivable pieces. It is not a message anyone wanted to hear, because it asks us to give up the thing we are least willing to give up, which is the efficiency, the scale, the speed, the seamless coupling of everything to everything that we experience, day to day, as the miracle of modern life. He was asking us to choose to be less efficient, on purpose, forever, in exchange for a safety we would never be able to see or measure, protection against disasters that, if the loosening worked, would simply never happen and therefore never thank us. That is a very hard thing to sell. It might be the hardest thing to sell there is, and so it does not get sold, and the tightening continues, and the corner gets more crowded every year. Here is the misconception I most want to take from you before the end, because it is the one that lets everyone sleep. The comforting belief is that these disasters, the blackout, the crash, the outage, are failures of execution. Somebody was careless. Somebody cut a corner. Some specific fixable thing went wrong. And now that we know about it, we can prevent it. And each disaster teaches a lesson that makes the next one less likely. And so over time, the system gets safer as we learn. That is the story every investigation tells, because an investigation's job is to find the fixable cause. And it is, for this class of system, a comforting lie. Because the normal accident is not a failure of execution. It is a success of execution. It is what the system does when everyone performs their role correctly, and the parts interact the way tightly coupled complex parts inevitably eventually interact. Fixing the specific cause of the last one, the specific trees, the specific chip, the specific malformed file, does not make the next one less likely, because the next one will come through a different combination that no investigation of the last one could have anticipated. You are not climbing a learning curve towards safety. You are patching the specific holes that already failed, while the system as a whole grows more complex and more tightly coupled underneath you, opening new holes faster than you close the old ones. The disasters are not teaching us to build safer systems. The disasters are the systems working as designed. And the deepest part, the part that connects all the way back to that room in Pennsylvania at 4 a.m, is that there is still no villain. That is what makes it so hard to look at directly. Human beings are built to respond to threats that have a face, an intention, an agent to blame and stop. We are very bad at fearing a structure. We can be furious at a careless executive or a negligent regulator, and sometimes we should be, but the normal accident does not require any of them to be careless. It happens when everyone is careful. It is produced by the shape of the thing, by the arrangement of the parts, by a wiring diagram that has no motive and cannot be punished and does not care. You cannot fire it. You cannot jail it. You cannot even hate it properly, because there is nothing there to hate. There is only the structure, sitting in every reactor and grid and market and cloud, carrying the accident inside itself the way we all carry our own death, waiting with infinite patience for the specific combination to come up. And it will come up. That is the thing the whole theory finally comes down to. Given enough time, in a system complex enough, and coupled tightly enough, every combination comes up eventually. The normal accident is not a question of if. It never was. It is only ever a question of when, and of how much of the world we will have coupled together by the time it does. I want to go back to that control room one more time, because I have been thinking about those men for a long time now, and about what it would have felt like to be one of them. It is 4 a.m. You are tired in the specific way of a night shift, but you are competent. You have trained for years, you know this plant. An alarm sounds, and then another, and then dozens of them, more alarms than you can read. More than the room was ever designed to present to a human being at once. And you begin, calmly, professionally, to work the problem. You look at your instruments, and your instruments tell you a story, and the story is coherent, and you act on it correctly. And every correct action makes it worse, and you do not know that, because the instruments that would tell you are the ones that are lying, and you have no way to know which ones are lying, because if you knew that you would already have solved it. You are doing everything right. You are a good operator having the worst night of your life, and the machine around you is quietly, obediently killing itself, and years later people who were not there, sitting in bright rooms with all the time in the world and the full truth in front of them, will read what you did and shake their heads and wonder how you could have missed it. Those men were not the failure. They were the last, most visible, most blamable component in a system that was designed, without anyone intending it, to occasionally do exactly what it did that night. And the reason their story matters to you, specifically, is that you are in a room like that right now. You have been in it your whole life. You just cannot see the walls. Because here is where this finally reaches you, and I am not going to soften it, because softening it would be a lie, and you did not come here for a lie. Every critical system your life depends on, the grid that powers the room you are in, the financial system that holds whatever you have managed to save, the supply chains that put food where you buy it, the digital infrastructure that carries your money and your medicine and your communication, the automated systems increasingly making decisions faster than any human can follow. Every one of them has been moving, for your entire life, in the same direction. More complex, more tightly coupled, more optimized, less slack, fewer humans in the loop, more of it resting on the same few shared foundations. Every year a little more efficient, which is to say every year a little further into the corner Perrow told us was fatal. And every year the improvement that pushes it deeper into that corner is reported to you as good news, as progress, as the world getting better and faster and more seamless. And it is getting better and faster and more seamless. That is not a trick. The efficiency is real. Your life is, in 1,000 small ways, easier and smoother, because these systems are as tightly coupled and optimized as they are. That is precisely why we will not stop. That is why the warning does not work, why the book gets cited 10,000 times and changes almost nothing, why every crisis produces a brief spasm of adding slack back in and then a slow, quiet return to squeezing it out again. We are not tightening these systems against our will. We are tightening them because the tightening is the same thing as the benefit. The efficiency and the fragility are not two properties in tension that we could balance if we were wiser. They are one property, seen from two sides, and to give up the fragility you would have to give up the efficiency, and nobody, at scale, over time, against competition, ever gives up the efficiency. And so we keep it. And we keep the fragility that comes welded to it. And we carry the accident forward inside the wiring, into every new system we build, more and more of it, coupled tighter and tighter, waiting. Perrow saw all of this, and it did not make him a mystic or a prophet. He remained to the end, a sociologist looking at structures, and he refused to dress the conclusion up as anything other than what it was. Near the close of the book that started it all, he wrote a line that I think is the truest thing anyone has said about the age we live in. He wrote that of all the glorious possibilities out there to reach for, some of them are going to be beyond our grasp in catastrophic ways. Not beyond our grasp because we are not clever enough to build them. We are clever enough. We built them. Beyond our grasp because building them means building the accident into them. Because the reach itself, the scale and the speed and the seamless coupling that make the glorious possibility possible, is the same reach that guarantees the catastrophe. We can have the thing, we just cannot have the thing without the accident that lives inside it. Those are not separable. They never were. He died in the autumn of 2019 in his sleep at 94 in Connecticut. A few months before he died, his own profession gave him its highest award for a lifetime of work. He did not live to see the pandemic seize the supply chains he had described, or the outage that took down 8.5 million machines through a safety system. or the wiring of artificial intelligence into the tight loops he had spent his life warning about. He got to stop watching. We do not. And this is the part I keep coming back to, the part that I still, honestly, do not know how to hold. In the old disasters there was at least a person in the room. There was an operator who did everything right, and even though he could not save the machine, he was there, a human presence at the centre of the catastrophe, someone who felt it happen. The direction we are moving removes even that. We are building systems where, when the normal accident finally comes, and it will come, there will be no one in the room at all. No operator reading a lying instrument, no trader watching the numbers fall. Just machines interacting with machines at a speed and complexity and opacity beyond any human capacity to follow, on shared foundations we cannot see, making the cascade happen in a fraction of a second across a world coupled so tightly that there is nowhere for the failure to stop. Nobody doing anything wrong, nobody doing anything at all. The structure, doing what the structure does, with the last witness removed. You will not see it coming. That is not a failure of vigilance. It is a property of the system. The whole reason the normal accident is normal is that it arrives through a combination nobody anticipated, faster than anyone can respond, and by the time it is visible, it is already finished. The operators at 3 Mile Island did not see it coming, and they were standing right on top of it, staring at the instruments, trained for exactly this. You are much further from the controls than they were, and the machine is much larger and much faster, and much more tightly wound than the one they stood inside, and there is no light on any panel, anywhere that is wired to tell you the truth about where the coupling has grown too tight. The accident is not a risk we are choosing to run. We passed that point a long time ago, on the day we decided that efficiency was the same thing as progress, and began removing the slack from everything we depend on. The accident is a property of the world we have built, sitting in the wiring of every system that keeps you alive, as patient as the death you carry in your own cells, and the only question the theory ever left open, the only one, is when the combination comes up, and how much of the world will be wired together on the morning that it does. A man in a control room did everything right, and the machine destroyed itself anyway. We are all in the room now. There is just no longer anyone at the controls.